Ever notice how we're kind of obsessed with the idea of instant persuasion?
Yeah, like there's this secret formula or a magic word that'll just make everyone agree with us.
Exactly. And the bookstores are packed with these gurus promising just that.
Oh, I know, like Bushra Azhar talking about flipping these psychological switches.
Right. Or Richard Bowerman and his simple steps to persuasion.
And don't forget Kevin Dutton, who even mentions a persuasion superstrain, like some kind of superpower.
It's tempting, right? This idea that you could just learn a few tricks and boom, you're suddenly irresistible.
Totally. But I think the sheer number of these so-called secrets kind of gives it away.
Yeah, if it were that easy, wouldn't there be just one foolproof method everyone's using?
Exactly. So that brings us to the bigger question, the one we're really diving into today.
Why are some people so darn convincing while others just aren't? What makes us say yes?
And, our listeners have probably felt this
Oh,
themselves.
for sure. Those times when you're totally swept up in someone's argument.
Or those times you just can't seem to get your point across, no matter how hard you try.
Ugh, frustrating. Right. So our mission in this deep dive is to go beyond those quick fix promises.
We're going to get down to the real nitty-gritty of persuasion, the fundamental principles.
And we're pulling from some pretty diverse sources. We're talking ancient wisdom like Aristotle.
Mixed with the latest findings from communication research, a real blend of old and new.
Because we want to understand the core of what makes people change their minds.
And through all that, we've zeroed in on four main areas that just keep coming up.
And it's not about learning how to manipulate people. That's not what we're about.
No, it's about understanding the way humans process information and make decisions.
So the first one up is credibility. Why we find some speakers believable and others not so much.
Right, sometimes called source credibility.
Or, if you want to sound fancy, ethos, like Aristotle used to say.
Now think about this. Let's say Sonia Sotomayor starts talking about the need for big changes in the U.S. judicial system.
Would you take that more seriously than, say, Aaron Rodgers making the same argument?
Now flip it. What if Rodgers is passionately explaining how technology is changing football?
Versus Sotomayor's take on the same thing. You see what I mean?
Our gut feeling is that each person is more believable in their own field.
Right. Because we assume they have more knowledge and experience in those areas.
And that's what shapes credibility. There are two main parts. First, competence, how intelligent, expert, knowledgeable the audience thinks the speaker is.
And then there's character. Do we see them as sincere, trustworthy, someone who cares about the audience, not just their own agenda?
Precisely. It's like, imagine you're in a university lecture.
You've got this famous economics professor, right?
Yeah.
They've written books, advised governments, the whole 9 yards.
But then one day, their equally qualified but less famous colleague has to fill in.
Even if they give the exact same lecture word for word.
You're probably listening differently, aren't you?
I know I would. It's that perception of greater competence that plays a role.
And here's a key takeaway. Credibility isn't some fixed quality a speaker has.
It's not like a personality trait.
No, it lives in the minds of the audience.
It's how they perceive the speaker.
Exactly. The same person could be super credible to one group and completely ignored by another.
And it's tied to the topic too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like our earlier example, being a football star doesn't make you an expert on the justice system.
No matter how passionately you speak. And another thing, credibility isn't static. It changes throughout a speech.
It's like a dynamic process.
Exactly. We talk about three types of credibility: initial, derived, and terminal.
So initial credibility is what you walk in with your reputation, your credentials, all that.
Like a head start in a race.
But you can totally blow it with a poorly prepared or delivered speech.
Oh, for sure. Conversely, someone who starts with low initial credibility can really boost their standing.
They can win over the audience by the end.
Remember the example of Amit Patel, the IT manager?
Oh yeah, the one where the system crashed.
His initial credibility was probably rock bottom after that.
Makes sense.
But by being transparent about the past issue and explaining all the research behind the new tablet rollout,
He regained everyone's trust.
exactly, his terminal credibility, how people saw him by the end, was much higher.
Okay, so we know credibility is important, but how do we actually improve ours?
Right, it's not enough to just say, be credible.
Luckily, the source gives us some concrete strategies.
First up, show off your competence. Don't be shy about sharing your research, your experience, anything that highlights your expertise.
Like that student who was arguing for a living wage.
Yeah, she made a point of mentioning her economics coursework and all the research she'd done.
So she wasn't just expressing an opinion, she was aligning herself with experts.
Exactly. And then there was the student who was advocating for equine therapy.
She talked about her time volunteering at a stable. So she had firsthand experience. These details tell the audience, hey, this person knows what they're talking about.
Another crucial tactic is finding common ground.
Because you won't persuade anyone if they think you're totally out of touch with their world.
Right. You need to show them you understand their values, their beliefs, even their experiences.
Like that businesswoman from Massachusetts who's trying to make a sale in Colorado.
Oh yeah, instead of launching into her pitch, she talked about her family's history in Colorado.
Showed she respected the local culture. Smart move.
It was brilliant. She created that instant connection.
And then there was the student who had to argue for a tuition increase.
Ouch, that's a tough one.
Right. But he started by emphasizing their shared desire for a high-quality education, something everyone could agree on.
That common goal made the rest of his argument much more palatable.
Now, let's not forget about delivery the way we actually speak.
Oh, that's huge. How you say something can be almost as important as what you say.
That's true. Research shows that a moderate pace and using vocal variety make you sound smarter and more confident.
Whereas saying and all the time makes you seem less prepared.
Yeah, it chips away at your credibility.
Which is why practice is so important. A smooth, engaging delivery not only makes your message clearer, but also boosts how credible you appear.
And there's something to be said for genuine passion, right? Truly believing in what you're saying.
Oh, absolutely.
The source even quotes Harry Truman on this. Sincerity and honesty are more powerful than all the talent in the world.
If you're truly convinced, that conviction comes through.
Okay, so we've talked about being believable, but
Yeah.
what about backing up our claims with evidence?
Right, that's the next big piece of the puzzle.
But what exactly counts as evidence when we're trying to persuade someone?
Evidence is basically any supporting material you use to prove your point. We're talking examples, statistics, expert testimony, anything that gives weight to your argument.
And the source really emphasizes why this is so crucial, especially if you're trying to change someone's mind.
Yeah, it's not enough to just state your opinion. You've got to back it up.
So why is evidence so important? I mean, it seems pretty obvious you need proof.
Well, for starters, most audiences are skeptical,
Right, they're not just going to take your word for it.
especially if they don't see you as an expert on that particular topic.
Makes sense.
Evidence forces you to actually prove what you're saying, and the benefits are huge.
Like what?
Well, it strengthens your credibility by showing you've done your research.
Makes you look more prepared.
Exactly. It also makes your argument more persuasive, both in the moment and down the line.
Interesting.
And it can actually protect your audience from counter-arguments they might hear later.
So you're saying if you address those counter-arguments up front with strong evidence.
You're sort of inoculating your audience against opposing views.
That's fascinating.
The case study about the U.S. mental health system really brings this to life.
Oh yeah, the one where the speaker doesn't just say the system is broken.
Right. They start with relatable examples.
Like a homeless person struggling with mental illness, an elderly person who can't access care.
A teenager who's falling through the cracks. Stories that really pull you in.
But then, crucially, they don't stop there.
They layer on the hard data.
Exactly. They anticipate the listener thinking, are these just isolated incidents?
And then, bam, they hit them with statistics from CNN.com showing the huge drop in state-funded psychiatric beds.
And to counter the argument that maybe people are just getting help elsewhere, they bring in Bernard Harcourt's research.
You know, the one showing the link between fewer mental health facilities and more people ending up in prison.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it doesn't stop there. They talk about the massive cost of untreated mental illness, citing the National Alliance on Mental Illness.
And they mentioned Time Magazine's report on the lack of mental health care for kids. It's this carefully crafted web of evidence.
And each piece is strategically placed to address a potential doubt in the listener's mind.
It's like a masterclass in anticipating skepticism and using evidence to shut it down.
Okay, so that's a great example, but how do we use evidence effectively?
Well, the source lays out some really helpful tips.
Let's hear them.
First off, be specific. Don't just say, it costs a lot of money. Say it costs $200 billion. That level of detail makes a huge difference.
It feels way more credible, right?
Exactly. And try to use novel evidence, stuff your audience hasn't heard a million times before.
Something that surprises them, makes them really pay attention.
Right. And this one's crucial for credibility. Always choose sources that are unbiased and respected in their field.
So you trust research from a neutral medical association more than a study funded by a company that stands to profit, right?
Precisely. And finally, and this is where many people trip up, make sure you explicitly connect your evidence to your argument.
Don't just throw out a statistic and assume the audience will get it.
Right, spell it out for them. Like in that example about motorcycle fatalities, the speaker didn't just give the numbers.
They explained how those numbers show the need for helmet laws.
Exactly. You have to make those connections clear.
So evidence is the backbone, the logic, what did Aristotle call it?
Logos.
Right, logos. But it's not enough just to have the facts, is it?
No, you need to weave them together in a way that makes sense.
You have to guide your audience through your thought process.
That's where reasoning comes in. Reasoning is the mental process of drawing conclusions from the evidence you've presented.
It's showing your audience, hey, look, this fact leads to this conclusion.
Precisely. That story about Hack Wilson and his manager trying to use a worm in a bottle of gin as evidence against drinking is perfect here.
Oh, the baseball player, what happened?
The manager was trying to make a point about the dangers of alcohol, right?
Right.
He shows Wilson this bottle of gin with a worm in it, all shriveled up.
So he's thinking, this will prove my point.
Exactly. But Wilson looks at it and says, well, if I drink gin, I won't get worms.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Talk about missing the point.
It's a great example of how, even with good intentions, if your audience doesn't follow your reasoning, your argument falls flat.
So in public speaking, there are two big things to keep in mind with reasoning.
One, you need to make sure your own logic is sound. No gaps or leaps in your thinking.
And two, you need to make sure your audience can follow along and actually agree with your conclusions.
Right.
So let's talk about the different types of reasoning we can use.
Sure. The source outlines 4 main approaches. First up, reasoning from specific instances.
So that's when you take a bunch of specific facts and draw a general conclusion from them.
Right. Like, let's say you've taken a few PE classes and they've all been pretty easy.
So you conclude that PE courses are generally easy.
Another example. You hear about a few banks engaging in unethical practices.
And then you argue that unethical behavior is widespread in the banking industry.
Exactly. But, and this is important, you have to be careful about jumping to conclusions here.
Right. Just because a few PE classes were easy doesn't mean all of them are.
That's the danger of a hasty generalization. To make this type of reasoning work, you need a good sample size.
Enough examples to make it convincing.
Right. And those examples need to be representative and unbiased. You can't just pick and choose the ones that fit your argument.
And it's always a good idea to back up your reasoning with statistics or expert testimony.
That shows your examples aren't just flukes, like that classic black swan example. You can see 1,000 white swans and assume all swans are white.
But then you see one black swan and your whole theory goes out the window.
Exactly. So be careful about making sweeping generalizations.
Okay, what's the next type of reasoning?
Reasoning from principle. This one goes in the opposite direction, from a general principle to a specific conclusion.
The famous example is, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal.
Exactly. And this type of reasoning was used powerfully by Susan B. Anthony in her fight for women's suffrage.
How so?
She started with the general principle that the Constitution guarantees voting rights to all citizens. Then, the specific premise that women are citizens.
And from that, she concluded that women have the right to vote.
Exactly. With this type of reasoning, it's important to make sure your general principle is solid, and if your specific premise is controversial, you need to back it up.
Right, you can't just assume everyone will accept your starting point without question.
Okay, third type. Causal reasoning. This one's all about cause and effect.
Like if you slip on ice and break your arm.
The ice is the cause, and the broken arm is the effect.
We use this kind of reasoning all the time to make sense of the world. But it can be tricky, right?
Oh, yeah. It's easy to make mistakes with causal reasoning. Just because 2 things happen in sequence doesn't mean one caused the other. That's the post hoc fallacy.
Like those superstitions. I wore this shirt and my team won, so now it's my lucky shirt.
Exactly. And be careful about oversimplifying. A lot of events have multiple causes, not just one.
So don't jump to easy answers.
Right.
And the final type.
Analogical reasoning.
That's comparing 2 similar situations and saying what's true for one is likely true for the other.
Like the tennis and ping pong example. If you're good at tennis, you'll probably pick up ping pong pretty quickly.
They use similar skills, right?
Exactly. Analogies are often used in debates about policies.
Like saying a policy will work in the U.S. because it worked in a similar country.
Right. The source gives the example of gun control debates where people compare the U.S. to England, Japan, Switzerland.
But the key to a strong analogy is making sure the two situations are truly alike in the relevant ways.
If they're not, the comparison falls apart.
Okay, so we've got our 4 types of reasoning.
But even with the best intentions, our logic can get fuzzy sometimes.
We make mistakes,
We fall into traps.
and these are called.
Fallacies. Basically, errors in reasoning that weaken your argument. The source lists 10 common ones.
Let's go through a few, just to refresh our memories.
Sure, we already talked about hasty generalization jumping to a conclusion based on too few examples.
Like saying all college dropouts are going to be millionaires because Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg did it.
Right. That's ignoring all the dropouts who didn't become billionaires. Then there's the false cause fallacy, or post hoc, ergo propter hoc, to give it its fancy Latin name.
That's a mouthful. What does it mean?
Basically, it's thinking that because B happened after A, then A must have caused B.
Like that old superstition that if the Washington Commanders win the Super Bowl, the stock market will go up.
Exactly. Just because those two things sometimes happen together doesn't mean one causes the other. They might be totally unrelated.
So correlation doesn't equal causation.
Exactly.
Okay, what about that one where you compared two things that aren't really similar?
Well, that's an invalid analogy, like that weird example. Employees are like nails. You have to hit them to make them work.
Ouch.
Right? That's a terrible analogy. Employees are people, not inanimate objects.
Okay, how about the bandwagon fallacy?
That's when you argue that something is right or good simply because it's popular.
Like those ads that say, everyone's switching to this brand.
Exactly. Just because something is popular doesn't mean it's the best.
What about a red herring? I always liked that name.
A red herring is a distraction. It's when someone brings up an irrelevant issue to try to shift the focus away from the real argument.
Like if a politician is accused of corruption and they start talking about their family values.
Exactly. They're trying to divert attention from the real issue.
And then there's ad hominem.
That's attacking the person instead of their argument. Like saying someone's economic policies are wrong because they come from a wealthy background.
Right, so you're attacking their character instead of engaging with their ideas.
Exactly. Though, as the source points out, there are some cases where a person's character is relevant to the argument.
Like if they're talking about honesty and they have a history of lying.
Exactly. In those cases, it's fair game.
What about the fallacy where you present only 2 options when there might be others?
That's the either-or fallacy, also called a false dilemma.
Like saying, we either raise taxes or cut funding for schools.
Right. Those might not be the only options. Maybe there are other ways to save money or generate revenue.
Okay, what about slippery slope?
Slippery slope is when you claim that one action will inevitably lead to a chain of terrible consequences.
Like saying, if we let kids use their phones in class, they'll never learn to focus, and then civilization will collapse.
A bit dramatic, right? With slippery slope, you need to show that each step in the chain is actually likely to happen. You need evidence, not just fear-mongering.
So don't get carried away with worst-case scenarios.
Right. Now for the appeal to tradition fallacy, that's when you say something is right, because that's how we've always done it.
Like the argument for keeping the Electoral College, just because it's been around for a long time.
Exactly. Just because something is old doesn't automatically make it good. We need to be open to new ideas and ways of doing things.
And of course, there's the opposite, the appeal to novelty.
That's when you say something is good just because it's new.
Like those new and improved slogans.
Exactly. New doesn't always mean better. Sometimes the old ways are best, and sometimes new things are just gimmicks.
Being able to spot these fallacies is so helpful, both in our own thinking and when we're listening to others.
Absolutely. It helps us separate good arguments from bad ones.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground credibility, evidence, reasoning, all those logical appeals that Aristotle called logos.
But there's one more piece to the persuasion puzzle, and it's a big one.
Emotions. Because we're not just rational beings.
Exactly. We're also emotional creatures, and tapping into those emotions is a powerful way to persuade.
This is what Aristotle called pathos, right?
Right. Pathos is all about making your audience feel something: sadness, joy, anger, hope, fear.
And this can be especially effective when you're talking about values or policies.
Like the Roman rhetorician Quintilian said, it is feeling and force of imagination that make us eloquent.
And the Scottish philosopher George Campbell added, when persuasion is the end, passion also must be engaged. So what are some common emotions speakers try to evoke?
Well, there's fear, compassion, pride, anger, guilt, even reverence. And each emotion is often linked to certain topics.
Like fear might be used when talking about climate change or crime.
Compassion when discussing poverty or animal welfare.
Pride when celebrating national achievements or heroic acts.
Anger when talking about injustice or corruption.
Guilt when encouraging people to donate to charity or volunteer their time.
And reverence when discussing historical figures or religious beliefs.
Okay, so how do speakers actually generate these emotions in their audience?
One powerful technique is using emotional language words that evoke strong feelings.
Like that example from the student speech about volunteer teaching. Remember those phrases like sparkle in the eyes of every child and glittering dreams of America?
Those words are so much more powerful than just saying kids are happy or they want a better future.
Right, they create a much more vivid image in the listener's mind, but you have to be careful not to overdo it with the emotional language.
Absolutely. If it feels forced or insincere, it can backfire.
What else can speakers do to evoke emotions?
Telling vivid stories is incredibly effective.
Because a good story pulls you in, makes you feel like you're right there.
Exactly. Instead of just saying malaria is a big problem, you tell the story of a specific child who's suffering from the disease. You describe their fever, their pain, their family's desperation. Suddenly, those dry statistics become real and heartbreaking.
It makes a huge difference.
And finally, the most important thing is to speak with genuine sincerity and conviction.
If you don't believe what you're saying, your audience can tell.
Exactly. Think about the most persuasive leaders and speakers throughout history.
Like Martin Luther King Jr. or Nelson Mandela.
Right. What made them so compelling?
Their passion, their absolute belief in their message.
Exactly. If you truly feel what you're saying, that passion will shine through, not just in your words, but in your tone of voice, your gestures, your facial expressions.
It's contagious.
Now, it's important to talk about the ethics of emotional appeals.
Right, because we've all seen examples of emotional appeals being used to manipulate or mislead people.
Absolutely. Like any powerful tool, emotional appeals can be misused. They can be used to stir up prejudice, spread misinformation, even incite violence.
Think about propaganda and hate speech.
Exactly. But they can also be used for good.
To inspire people to act for positive change.
Right. Think about the movements for civil rights, for environmental protection, for ending poverty. All of those relied on emotional appeals to mobilize people.
So the key is to use them responsibly and ethically.
Exactly. It comes down to the speaker's intentions and the way they use those emotional appeals.
And it's not always a clear separation between reason and emotion, right?
No, often they work together. That story about the child with malaria, for example.
It evokes compassion, but it's also a piece of evidence showing the devastating effects of the disease.
Exactly. It's not wrong to feel moved by that story and want to do something to help. Emotional appeals are generally considered appropriate when you're trying to motivate people to take action.
Like with policy issues.
Right. But they're less appropriate when dealing with purely factual matters. When you're presenting scientific evidence or historical data, the focus should be on logic and accuracy.
So it seems like the key takeaway is that emotional appeals should never replace solid evidence and reasoning.
Absolutely. You still need that logical foundation. But emotional appeals can amplify your message, make it more memorable, and inspire people to act.
And always remember those ethical guidelines for public speaking.
Right. Have ethically sound goals, be honest in your presentation, and avoid any language that is abusive or dehumanizing.
Emotional appeals should be used to uplift and inspire, not to manipulate or harm.
So let's recap what we've learned in this deep dive into the world of persuasion. We've explored the 4 pillars: credibility, evidence, reasoning, and emotional appeals.
And while there's no guaranteed formula for success,
Understanding these principles will make you a much more effective communicator.
so here's a challenge for our listeners. Pay attention to the persuasive messages you encounter every day.
In ads, in conversations, in the news.
Try to analyze them through the lens of these 4 principles. How is the speaker building credibility? What kind of evidence are they using? Does their reasoning make sense? Are they appealing to your emotions?
By becoming more aware of these dynamics,
You'll be a savvier consumer of information and a more persuasive communicator yourself.
and maybe even think back to times you've tried to persuade someone. What did you do well? What could you have done differently?
Food for thought.